1,600 presidential candidates. Can you imagine that? I mean, how from now until then, a month from now, narrow down to one person? Professor Marandi, help us to understand the situation.
Yes, that is a problem. This is a loophole that exists in the presidential law where more or less anyone can register to stand as president, but the criteria for actually being allowed to run for presidency is different, and the Guardian Council has to look through the different applications and see who is qualified. The Guardian Council is not a clerical body, as was said in the report. 6 members of the Guardian Council are senior religious figures who are also scholars in legal affairs, and the other 6 are lawyers. So the Guardian Council goes through the different files and the requests, and ultimately, as in previous occasions, 5 or 6 people who are political heavyweights will be allowed to stand. Mm-hmm. So I think that by the end of next week, when the candidates are announced, we will have a handful of people, but they are from they'll be from different political parties and political persuasions.
Right. The Republic of Iran is actually Islamic Republic of Iran. It is an Islamic democracy. Mr. Lee, without going into all the details about what democracy should be about, help us to understand what does that term mean in the case of Iran?
I think, the name, I think the formal official name of the Iran is the Islamic Republic of Iran. That is, try to a kind of a combination, just between the Islamic and democracy. Just like the Iranian President Rouhani made once very clear that the political system or the founder of this republic at the very beginning try to put Islamic with democracy together, just like a coin with democracy and the Islamic of the both sides of a coin.
Interestingly said, but which side usually it is being shown to the public? That is a question, isn't it? Yeah. Let's go to Mr. Mousavi for answers about that. How does that work? Political leadership, religious structure. The supreme leader being the commander-in-chief, being the political authority, top authority, and also the religious leader. How does that work with the president? What is the latest situation, Mr. Mousavi?
Yes, so as your guest mentioned, the Iranian system is a Islamic democracy, and it has been tried to be that since the beginning of the revolution. The way the system works is essentially you have a president that is directly elected by the people. On the other hand, you have a parliament that is also directly elected by the people, and you have a supreme leader that is indirectly elected by the people. The people essentially they elect a council of experts who then choose the supreme leader. And in Iran, the supreme leader has certain authorities, as you mentioned, the armed forces, for example, as well as the judiciary and the police. And at the same time, very important ministries, in fact, all of them are controlled by the president. And it includes the foreign ministry as well as the intelligence ministry, interior ministry. So it's a sharing of balance of power, essentially, between the Islamic figures in the system as well as, if you would like to call, the more executive officials of the system who are directly elected by the people.
Right. So thank you so much, the three of you gentlemen, for helping us understand the ABCs of the Iranian political system. It's extremely important to set the stage. And now, let's go to the real questions. Professor Marandi, we understand the supreme leader actually has his favorite, and he has shown his attitude when others are trying to apply as a candidate for the president. For example, Mr. Rouhani, he has not necessarily given much support to after this first term, likely. So What would that mean? The Supreme Leader's opinion in the eventual choice of president of your country this time?
Well, I think that that is a bit of a myth that is very widespread in Western think tanks. The leader has never actually given any public support to any of the candidates in previous elections, and in the current election he has not said anything that could indicate that he prefers one candidate over another. For example, President Rouhani, he was the head of the Supreme National Security Council for well over a decade, and he was chosen by the leader, and after he was no longer the head, he was the representative of the leader in the Supreme National Security Council. So his credentials show that he has always had a strong link with Ayatollah Khamenei. So I don't really think that he has made any indication whatsoever, as the same is the case 4 years ago. 4 years ago, the leader too had made no indication whatsoever who he prefers. The Guardian Council, once they select those candidates who they consider to be heavyweights, who can stand as president, then basically it's for people to choose. And we've had different political persuasions chosen over the past 2 decades. I would say that the presidency in Iran has become something very difficult to predict since the 1990s.
I see.
During the 1980s, because of the Iran-Iraq War, there usually was a consensus candidate for the presidency. Not so much so in parliament, but for the presidency. But after the war came to an end and the country was no longer facing exceptional circumstances, rivalries became much more intense, and that's why the turnout for Iranian presidential elections are always so high. The past election, we had 73% turnout, and in the election before that, it was over 80%.
Right. Mr. Mousavi, we understand, at least in international media reports, there has been quite a competition between the current president, Mr. Rouhani, who is being portrayed as being a moderate in international relations about Iran toward the others, vis-a-vis Mr. Raisi, who has been termed as quite a hardliner. What is your opinion about how much Iran's international and regional ambition would play in the voters' decision about who should be and will be the president?
Yes, I think it is definitely important. I mean, foreign policy always has an impact on domestic economics, and that is the case everywhere. So people do consider the fact of the foreign policy agenda of different candidates. Nevertheless, in this current election, the scene has become very complicated. You have three forces. On the one hand, you have the so-called moderate/reformists led by Rouhani, the current president, and as you might probably have heard, his vice president actually registered on the final day as well. And some people are analyzing that as a complicated game where his vice president will support him during the debates and withdraw at the very end, so maybe he won't run for election. And on the other hand, from the principalist camp, which are in support of the original ideals of the revolution, you have, like you mentioned, Raisi, and then you also have Ghalibaf, who is the current mayor of Tehran. And in that camp, essentially they are critical of the nuclear agreement reached with the P5+1. Nevertheless, what I should add is the main foreign policy objectives of countries, they do not change necessarily with the change in power. And that is not only the case in Iran, you also see that in countries like the United States. So there will definitely be changes in Iran's foreign policy, but I wouldn't predict major changes.
Really?
Especially since the nuclear agreement is, yes, because I think the nuclear agreement was blessed by the Iranian supreme leader. It was approved by the Iranian parliament. So I think even if there is a new president, he would not necessarily scrap the deal.
Right.
And I think the main foreign policy objectives of the country would probably stay the same. Now, the only factor that is different from what I mentioned is ex-President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, excuse me. Although we have to wait and see whether he will be able to run, as your report mentioned, the final list of candidates will come out in about 10 days, and that will be decided by the Guardian Council. But if Ahmadinejad does run and he is in fact elected, then maybe there would be more changes compared to someone such as Raisi or such as Ghalibaf.
Mr. Lee, that's exactly what I want to bring up. In fact, Mr. Ahmadinejad has been quite a conservative, at least being portrayed as so, compared to the current president, Mr. Rouhani. And at this point, we understand there are sanctions from the West that has not been lifted up as being protested by Iran since the deal was being signed. So in that direction, will certain kind of cynicism in a way be nurtured among the public, and therefore those conservative might have a bigger chance vis-a-vis the what we call the moderate?
I think, as our Iranian guest has said, and actually, my analysis for the coming Iranian and presidential elections are mainly between the current President Rouhani and we call the hardliners or the principalists and Ibrahim Raisi. There are two very serious competitors. As the former President Ahmadinejad, I don't believe the first, I think, for him is he has to go through the guiding council's vetting.
Right.
And since the Supreme Leader has already advised him not to do it, so for the public, he is disobey the Supreme Leader's advices. May maybe disqualified for running the presidency. I think if Rouhani be re-elected, the Iranian foreign policy or domestic policies would remain the same. But if they raise to be elected as the Iranian new president, it will be very hard to say that there will be no major changes of Iranian foreign policy, especially towards the Americans.
Well, Professor Marandi, we see a lot of changes, in fact, since the nuclear deal was signed between Iran and some of the other parties. For example, there is a rising crisis in Syria, and it seems that Mr. Trump, his administration, has already taken a position. Iran, Russia, and Syria, rather, is on the other side. And meanwhile, there has been a lot of changes going on in the region. Trump administration going further over to Israel and also Saudi Arabia, which of course countries that Iran has some problem with throughout history. So what would that mean, this regional and international map, for the mentality of the voters and certainly the political atmosphere in your country?
One thing that I think we have to keep in mind is that politics in Iran, except for President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who is a different sort of candidate, I would say that politics in Iran have moved somewhat towards the center. In other words, the radical reformists and the radical conservatives or principalists, they are sort of out of the picture in this election. Mr. Raisi, Mr. Ghalibaf, President Rouhani, and most of the other potential candidates, they are close to the center. And for example, the two principalists that were named, there are others who are standing for candidacy, but for election, but they are more or less close to Foreign Minister Zarif. Zarif, of course, Dr. Zarif is in the cabinet as well, so obviously Rouhani is close to him as well, or he is close to Rouhani. So with regards to the major candidates, I don't see a major shift in Iranian foreign policy. Of course, this excludes former President Ahmadinejad. Former President Ahmadinejad, I I have doubts that the Guardian Council will accept him. They will vote. There are 12 people. If he gets 7, he'll be able to stand. But I think that because of that he's seen as a somewhat divisive character, and also because his first vice president landed himself in jail for financial issues,
right.
and so did another vice president of his go to jail briefly. He may not be allowed to run, but I think in general the issue is not so much foreign policy. Foreign policy will be, if it's one of the principalists or one of the, let's say the President Rouhani,
right.
Foreign policy will more or less be similar to what we have, but it is the economy that's the main issue. Right now, the major fight is over the economy, and the conditions for especially the middle and lower middle classes.
Professor Marandi, that's exactly the point. Your economy has a lot to do with how much access you have to the international market and how much interaction you can have with the rest of the global trade. And that has a lot to do with the sanctions the West has on Iran. And the deal, nuclear one, has in a way cleared up some of the sanctions, but some sanctions still remain there. So that is why the foreign policy is very relevant here, because it's closely linked to your economy. So in that regard, Professor Marandi, if I could follow up by asking you, what would this really show of power and strength by the Trump administration over the past 1 week or two, particularly militarily, mean? Both in Syria, in Afghanistan, you see as well, and certainly aircraft carrier going to the waters of the Korean Peninsula, mean to Iranians, who is now in the middle of uncertainties?
Yes, as I said earlier, of course, that I think that whoever is elected, the leader will expect continuity in Iranian foreign policy, and I think that the Supreme National Security Council will also move in the same direction. But with regards to the policies of the United States, I think that is a question that many Iranians and analysts are asking themselves, but I think the same is true in Moscow and Beijing, and that the United States is behaving in a very, let's say, unpredictable way. Nevertheless, I think the mood in Tehran is that Iran under no circumstances will back down from its support of the Syrian government in its fight against extremists, because for Iran this is an existential threat. If the extremists that have been supported by regimes in the region that advocate Wahhabism,
right.
or if the extremists that have been supported by neighboring countries, if they get the upper hand, then this terrorism will expand far beyond the borders of Syria. So I think that what is happening is that countries like Iran and Russia, for example, have actually moved closer to each other as a result of U.S. policy in Syria over the past couple of weeks. And I think probably the fact that the United States is behaving in the same way in the Korean Peninsula can also have the potential to draw Iran, Russia, and China closer to one another in order to put pressure on the United States not to behave in this sort of manner.
Well, we'll see how your prediction would work. But Mr. Mousavi, in Iran, of course, it's a Shia Muslim, and there's also the Sunni Muslims as well. The sectarian differences is extremely big, and some say it also has a lot to do with the political structure and political potentials. By the way, your system began with the students' movement, after which there has been a combination of religious and also political structures. So, Mr. Mousavi, having said all of this, how will this mixture and the moving factors in all areas eventually have an impact on this election only 1 month from now?
Yes. Before answering this question, if I may add just a small point to the previous question.
Sure.
As you mentioned, the following election is mainly going to be about the economy. Now, the way foreign relations is going to be connected to this issue is that even though according to polls we have right now, President Rouhani is in the lead by about 10 points, although we have to wait to see the debates, and the polls will probably change after the debates. Right now he's ahead by about 10 points from all the other candidates. Nevertheless, the weak point of Rouhani is going to be the economy. And the reason for that is after the nuclear agreement, Iranians were expecting for a lot of improvements in the Iranian economy. Now, in reality, even though over a year has passed since the implementation of the nuclear agreement, ordinary Iranians have not really seen much change in their day-to-day lives. Like you mentioned, some of the sanctions have been lifted, but on the street at least, the economy has not moved by much. And President Rouhani is definitely going to be attacked on that issue. And the coming into power of Donald Trump is actually going to make things worse because he has a much more harsher line towards Iran. So the expectation of the nuclear agreements bringing fruits for Iran is even less probable right now with the coming in power of Donald Trump. Regarding the question you mentioned,
briefly,
as you said, Iranian politics is pretty complicated. There is religion, there is politics, there are social movements. Now, the issue of Shia Sunni, as you mentioned, over 80% of Iran is actually Shia. So the next president is most probably going to be a Shia Muslim. Although I should add that Sunnis do have many members of parliament. Nevertheless, I think this is not going to be a probably important issue in the coming election. The main issue right now in Iran is economy. The economy is not doing so well, even though the nuclear agreement has passed. As you mentioned, that is going to be a major source of debate, and the economy is very closely linked to foreign issues.
It is the economy, as every presidential election in any country really is about. Mr. Lee, before we go, only left 30 seconds for you. A final word from you? Where is it going a month from now?
I think there will be debate, as our friends say, that the focus on who people would think would maybe bring them a better life, who would win the elections.